The history of the railway in Esterhazy began with promises. Nearly 140 years ago, in 1883, when the settlement rested along the northern banks of the Little Cutarm Creek, a steamboat service was promised up the Qu'Appelle River with the smaller boats. A year later, in 1884, promises were made once again. This time, the Manitoba and Northwest Railway vowed to run a track just along the north banks of the creek. A year later, the Souris and Rocky Mountain Railway promised the same. The railway would run past the site. None of these promises were ever followed through. Count Paul Esterhazy was instrumental in having the railway brought through the area. It was a result of his contacts with the Canadian Pacific Railway and Canadian government immigration agents that he became interested in Western Canada as a possible home for Hungarian immigrants. As the Canadian Pacific Railway, or CPR, was most interested in seeing the West be settled as quickly as possible, they knew that a railway was needed. From here, Count Paul Esterhazy began recruiting prospective immigrants for two distinct areas of settlement, the Huns Valley, Manitoba, and the Qu'Appelle Valley of Samboya, Northwest Territories, now Saskatchewan. The railroad still did not make its way to Esterhazy for some time. When Count Paul Esterhazy led settlers here, they departed the railway in Whitewood before making their way to the Kaposvar settlement south of the present town. The final justification for the railroad was never completely known. Several factors contributed to the railway being built, including Count Esterhazy's influence and significant figures, John E. Forslund's report on the colony, and Istvan Baras's letter to Esterhazy asking for a railroad. After approaching the Governor General, a railway was eventually granted. The railway station was eventually built after Reverend Francis Woodcutter, a priest at Kaposvar, purchased a quarter section of land which had previously been abandoned by Jacob Harushka as it was described as not good for cultivation. The Reverend paid $460 for this piece of land, a pricely amount to pay for what was seemingly a useless piece of land. The quarter section of land eventually went on to house the railway station and a large part of the village. What is now known as Esterhazy became a whole new place in 1902 when the graders of the Kirkella branch of the CPR came. The new railway station ran between the Sumner and Kaposvar colonies, and the new station of the CPR was called Esterhazy, after the count who founded the thriving Hungarian colony. The first train came through on January 3, 1904. Although this was only meant to be a 2-hour trip, it ended up taking all day because of difficulties. Despite these initial difficulties, the village prospered with the arrival of the railway. A train service went west in the morning and east in the evening, allowing mail and goods to be delivered twice a day. Early pioneers now had a mode of transportation that gave them more accessibility to the world around them. In the January of 1907, the daily service, which had been offered previously, was cut down to 3 days a week. At the same time, that water was struck east of town by the B&B department of CPR. This water was excellent quality, and a temporary tank was put up. In the May of 1908, land was bought for a Bremberry-Esterhazy branch line, and construction began. In the following year, 1909, improvements were made to the CPR station, including a 50-foot extension on the freight sheds. This expansion made Esterhazy the largest station on the Kirkella branch. During this time, the old express area was made into dwelling facilities for the agent. 2 acres of land was purchased in 1911 from Mr. R. Brayers in the valley of the Big Cutarm, where Esterhazy Bremberry cut-off crosses. The land was purchased for the company to build an engine house, pipe stand, as well as a pipeline into Bremberry along the right-of-way. In the September of this year, CPR surveyors arrived and laid out the pipeline from Little Cutarm Creek to Esterhazy in preparation to supply CPR with an ample amount of water for their locomotives. In the April of 1913, the village councillors met to discuss allowing the use of Main Street for laying the pipeline to the creek from the CPR track. Later that year, a notice was sent out in the Observer, which stated the following.
Notice is hereby given that in accordance with the provision of the Irrigation Act, the Canadian Pacific Railway Company have filed the necessary memorial plans required by Sections 13 and 15 of the said Act, with the Commissioner of Irrigation at Calgary, Alberta. The applicant company applies for the right to divert 1/5 of the cubic foot of water per second from Kaposvar Creek on the southwest quarter of Section 34-19-1 west of the 2nd for industrial purposes at Esterhazy and for the right to construct the necessary works as shown by the memorial and plans filed to enable the water so diverted to be used for said industrial purposes in the company's engines, tanks, and buildings situated at Esterhazy. The said southwest quarter of Section 34, northwest quarter, Section 27, and certain streets of the town of Esterhazy are affected by the right-of-way for the proposed works.
In the October of that year, farmers were given the chance to rent land from the CPR on 20-year terms with only 1/20th of the purchase price. 2 train accidents of note occurred in 1916, the first only a slight accident on the CPR branch near Kirkella Junction involving a passenger train eastbound. A more serious accident occurred only a few days later at half a mile west of Esterhazy involving a freight train, which would cause a delay in the mails. The following year, an engineer, John Bozeman, was killed in early April between Esterhazy and Stockholm. Weather, too, had a strong impact on train services. Extreme weather events, such as blizzards, could delay trains from arriving or leaving once again. Expansions progressed slowly with the railway for quite some time. Land occasionally would be purchased. Over time, the services slowed down, eventually leading trains to only have scheduled trips every other day. The last scheduled passenger service from Esterhazy stopped on October 24, 1959. 12 years later, on August 9, 1971, the CPR station closed its doors for the last time. A year later, this iconic building in Esterhazy history was sold and moved by Mr. and Mrs. Philip Apple to their farm site to be used as their farmhouse, which was the perfect fit as this was the location which the station was originally supposed to call home before it had been built in its first location, close to where the museum sits now. The CPR track continued to operate through Esterhazy, carrying farmers' grain until the July of 1996 when the last train left Esterhazy and the line was abandoned. After 92 years, the CPR in Esterhazy was no more. It's been over 25 years now since a train has been through Esterhazy, and nearly 20 since the railway was taken out, but people still remember the days of trains.
You'd be crazy to not subscribe to Esterhazy Community Museum's YouTube page.